The South African agricultural exports remain robust. In 2025, our exports reached a record $15.1 billion. That is up 10% from 2024. And I'm sure that many people may be concerned to say, where is this growth coming from? Because for much of 2025, the topic that we discussed the most was really our concerns about what the trading environment would look like globally. And this was not a matter just because of our difficulties with the US, but also just the way the world has been changing. Because remember, since the announcement of the Liberation Day tariffs by the United States government, many countries across the world began looking across and saying, where can they expand their export markets? And in South Africa, we also began talking about the diversification of our exports. And of course, we were worried about what would happen to some of the products that we export to the United States. And I'll admit that the US generally is not a big market for South Africa when you are looking from a national perspective in the agricultural sector. It generally is around 4% of the South African agricultural exports, but it cannot be minimized because there's a number of industries that are dependent in those exports that go to the US, and particularly from a regional perspective. The Western Cape and parts of Mpumalanga that are exporting nuts, and the Western Cape, of course, the table grapes, wine, citrus, and some of the ostrich products. Those are some of the industries that were concentrated within the US market. But I think the major concern for many people was whether we can remain as competitive and continue to see our exports growing. Because remember, even in 2024, we had reached a fresh high of our exports at $13.7 billion. Now, we were thinking perhaps maybe we will dwindle around those levels or we will increase marginally from that to 14 billion. But I think reaching $15.1 billion, which is 10% up from 2024, is quite an achievement. And one may ask then to say, what was driving these exports? Because the other thing that we definitely saw, especially towards the end of 2025, is that the South African rand has strengthened quite a lot, which in a way then I would say slightly reduced our competitiveness in the export markets. So I would say the key driver of our exports is really the fact that we had a lot of volume in a number of industries. Remember, we had ended 2025 by saying it was a mixed agricultural year. At the time when we were talking about a mixed agricultural activity, there were two subsectors that we said they powered up the growth. It was the horticulture, which is the fruit and vegetable, as well as a field crop, which is mainly the grains, oilseeds, and sugarcane. Where the difficulties lied in our industry, it was mainly in the livestock industry, particularly because of the foot and mouth disease that we still struggle with in parts of South Africa. But that improvement in grain production in part is what actually has supported these exports. But of course, the fruit industry has powered through, because if you look just at the list of our exports, you will see that the fruit industry, wine and grains are right there at the top. And of course, wool is also one of the products that we continue to export. And on fruit, a whole range of fruit, from nuts to citrus to table grapes, apples and pear, peaches, berries, all of the range of fruits that we produce in South Africa, they did reasonably well on the exports, and we remained fairly competitive in a number of markets. So when you see that figure of a $15.1 billion, that is a record high for South African agriculture exports, it's really on the back of that large output that we have. The output was large because we had a good or favorable agricultural season. We were in the La Niña rainfall, we received sufficient rain that supported the production conditions. But of course, we cannot underestimate the investment that for years have been made by the farmers, bringing in new technologies, breeding seeds that improve their productivity at a farm level, but also a number of other mechanical technologies that have been brought in to ensure that the efficiencies at the farm level, they improve. So that's the catalyst behind that output that we saw in the South African agricultural sector. But of course, farmers can produce, but there's an aspect of logistics. And one of the things that for many years in South Africa we've been talking about is how our ports are not performing to the levels that we would expect them to be, to an extent that there started to be some joint venture activities between the private sector as well as the government. And I think that all of those joint efforts, they contributed to this increase that we saw in the exports. And yes, I know that if you are farming in the Western Cape, in the Northern Cape, at the end of last year, November, December, you were struggling with the Port of Cape Town, which was not performing as we expected. The issues of heavy winds and some management aspects here and there were some of the things that weighed on that. But I think now there is a bit of a grip on where the problem was, and people are fixing that. And if you look at the other ports in South Africa, we've been able to see meaningful improvement on that. And I think this issue then of a better functioning ports also added to these gains, because it's a one thing to produce and have a commodity and have a buyer demanding this product. It's another thing then to ensure that the logistics to move these products are in order. And I think that in March of 2025, we were in a far better position compared to, say, 2024. Now, we've been looking at this thing on a quarterly basis as to say what's going on. And you recall that for March of the year 2025, those of you who have been with us on AgriView, and if you haven't watched these episodes, you should look in our channel. We talked about all of the other quarters of the year 2025 when we were receiving the trade data. The $15.1 billion of agriculture exports we're coming up with now, because we just received the last quarter data on agricultural trade in South Africa. And if you look at the numbers just purely on the fourth quarter now, which is part of the 15 billion that I've talked about, the exports on the fourth quarter were around $3.4 billion, which is up 7% on a year-by-year basis. And of course, then the fourth quarter figures, what was driving it and what were some of the fundamentals behind it is exactly what I've just explained, which underpins really our performance for the year. But the one thing that I'm looking at in front of me on these papers is the key question that I know many people always ask to say, okay, fine, we see these exports, but where are these exports actually going? And the African continent remains core to our agricultural exports activity. It accounts for roughly half of our exports, and I'll tell you what, in the last quarter of 2025, about 53% of our agricultural exports went to the African continent. So that's a big one. And within that African continent, we know that about 90% of those exports are within the Southern Africa region. So 90 cents in every dollar, you really get income in that Southern Africa region. So we have to maintain those relations. We have to continue making sure that we have a good relationship with the folks in the region. Even the likes of Botswana and Namibia that typically block our agriculture exports, conversations to unlock those blockages is something that needs to happen between South Africa and them. And of course, South African authorities always open to conversation to ensure that we listen to what the folks in Botswana and Namibia have to say and make sure that we support them in their endeavor to produce and increase their domestic production, but also we smoothen trade in our region. So that's another aspect. But if you think about the second largest region of our agriculture exports in the last quarter of 2025, that was about the Middle East and Asia. They accounted for 17% of the South African agricultural exports. And when you think about the baskets that go to this region, in the African continent, it's largely the apples, pears, grains, soybean oil, sugar, and the likes. But if you think about the Middle East and Asia, you begin to see meat, you begin to see wool, and of course the fruit are some of the products that we send to the Middle East and Asia. And in fact, we hope that in Asia, we will now see even a much greater share. Because in the first week of February, the South African Trade and Industry and Competition Minister, the DTIC, came out and say, hey, look, South Africa has now signed the Africa-China trade framework. And what that framework does, it endeavors to lower the tariffs so that South African products can be able to access better the Chinese market. We'll talk about the possibilities of that on its own segment here on AgriView. We'll dive into China, as well as what are some of the really possibilities in the Chinese market. But the key point I wanted to add is that as we start that stronger relationship with China, lowering the tariffs, we were likely to see that Asia, Middle East part of our exports growing even larger than that. The EU remains ever more important, accounting for about 16% of our agricultural exports. And we know that in the EU, you find wool, you find fruit, and you find wine. And the EU is very important. It's a high-value market. And maintaining those strong relations with the EU is something that, as South Africa, we always want to make sure that we keep going. And of course, the UK is one of the single important market. Around 7% or so of South African agricultural exports go to the UK, and you have the rest of the world. But I will single out the Americas, because in the Americas, in the last quarter, it was still about 4%. The US remained an important market for us, but here is the key point that I want to put forward about the US. If you look at South Africa's agricultural exports for 2025, the exports to the US fell by only 3%. We exported just over $500 million of agricultural products to the US. The reason for that is because in the first quarter, there were no Liberation Day tariffs. Second quarter, we've got the 90-day pause that the US president provided to the world, and folks managed to utilize that period quite aggressively. The only period we started to see the tariffs biting us was in the third quarter, where South Africa's agricultural exports to the US fell by 11%, and much more severely in the last quarter, where our agricultural exports to the US, they fell by 39% to around 81 million US dollars, where in a usual quarter, we will be exporting something that is over 140 million US dollars. So that just shows you then that when you are looking at the annual figure and you're hearing people saying, no, man, these tariffs are not really causing much of a problem. We have our exports still down by 3%. No, they are causing problems. But I think we will begin to see the impact of this in 2026. But some of us who are optimists, we hope that by that time we would have found some form of a trade agreement with the US. We are still part of AGOA. It was extended. We remain part of that. That bodes well in terms of just the general sentiment as to what's going on between us and the United States. But we do need some form of a trade agreement in order to be able to get through that. But I've been talking a lot about exports, as if South Africa doesn't buy anything from the world. We do buy stuff from the world. And I'll tell you this, if you look at how much we bought and how much we spent buying things from the world in 2025, South Africa spent 7.8 billion US dollars. That is up 4% from 2024. And the products that we buy a lot are rice, wheat, palm oil, poultry products, and whiskey. Those are things that we still buy quite a lot as South Africa, and I think we will continue to do that. But I think the key underlying factor is that we remain with a positive, with a trade surplus as South Africa's agricultural sector. And our trade surplus in 2025 was $7.3 billion. So with all of this environment changing in terms of the global landscape on trade, we remain quite strong in exports. And that's the picture of 2025. The core thing about 2026 is building on that optimism. Things are looking reasonably better at a production level. We continue to struggle with the foot and mouth disease, but there's a whole range of plans about the vaccination. And I think that as we recover and we benefit from better production conditions at a farming level, and we see improvement at the ports, these are all things that lay the foundation for a better export performance for 2026. But certainly 2025 was a better year. So folks, if you were wondering, I think that anyone you hear talking about trade in South Africa, make sure that you send this video to them. And if you are watching us for the first time because you heard the figure, 15.1 billion US dollars, you better make sure that you subscribe in this channel, because there's so much of South African agricultural things that we will continue to discuss with you. And we do all of this because we have support of many industries that make sure that we can record this. And this time around, our folks at Nedbank have ensured that we can deliver this message to you. So we are grateful to them. And thanks to you for watching.